You're listening to the Chapter a Day Bible Study. I'm John Stange, and today we're in Joshua 12. The kings defeated east and west of the Jordan. Joshua 12 may seem like a chapter we're tempted to skim. It's largely a list of defeated kings and conquered territories. But this chapter serves an important purpose because it's a testimony to the faithfulness of God. Every defeated king listed in this chapter represents a fulfilled promise. Every conquered city is evidence that the Lord did exactly what he said he would do. The chapter is divided into two major sections. The first section recounts the victories Moses led east of the Jordan River. The second section records the victories Joshua led west of the Jordan. Together, they form a historical summary of God's power and his covenant faithfulness to Israel. Joshua 12 reminds us that God doesn't forget his promises, and it points us toward Jesus, the greater Joshua, who leads his people into an eternal inheritance. The chapter opens by reminding Israel of the victories God gave through Moses. Verse 1 says, "Now these are the kings of the land whom the people of Israel defeated and took possession of their land beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise." The chapter goes on to describe the defeat of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. These were intimidating rulers. Og, in particular, was remembered as a giant among men. And yet both kings fell before the power of God. These victories happened before Israel even fully crossed into the Promised Land. God was already demonstrating his ability to give his people victory over enemies that seemed impossible to defeat. That same principle remains true for believers today. Before we even realize it, God is often at work preparing the way ahead of us. He's removing obstacles we can't move ourselves. He's opening doors we couldn't force open. He's proving his strength long before we fully understand what he's doing. The second half of the chapter lists 31 kings defeated under Joshua's leadership in Canaan. Their names are carefully recorded one by one. Verse 9 says, "The king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, 1. And then the list continues through city after city, king after king. Some of these victories were dramatic and memorable, like Jericho. Others are barely mentioned elsewhere in Scripture, and yet God considered every one of them worth recording. God values complete obedience and complete remembrance. Israel wasn't meant to forget what the Lord had done for them. This chapter served as a permanent testimony for future generations. I think it's easy for us to forget victories that God has already given us. I think we quickly move from one challenge to another without pausing to remember his faithfulness. But Scripture repeatedly calls God's people to remember. When we remember God's faithfulness in the past, it strengthens our confidence in the present. Psalm 77:11 says this, "I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old." Well, Joshua 12 is essentially a written memorial. It's Israel's reminder that no enemy stood a chance against the Lord's purposes. This chapter also highlights the seriousness of spiritual warfare. The kings of Canaan represented opposition to God's covenant purposes. Israel wasn't merely fighting political battles. There was a spiritual dimension to these conflicts as the Lord established his people in the land that he had promised to Abraham centuries earlier. And in the same way, believers today face spiritual opposition. It's wise to be aware of this. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 tells us this, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness." But Joshua 12 encourages us with this truth. Every enemy opposing God's ultimate plan will eventually fall. And that's where this chapter strongly points us toward Jesus. Joshua led Israel into an earthly inheritance. Jesus leads his people into an eternal inheritance. We've mentioned that as we've studied previous chapters in Joshua, but I wanted to highlight it again. And here we see that Joshua defeated earthly kings. Well, what does Jesus do? He defeats sin, death, and Satan. Joshua brought military victory to Israel. Jesus brings spiritual victory to all who trust in him. The long list of defeated kings in Joshua 12 foreshadows the complete triumph of Christ over every opposing power. The New Testament repeatedly emphasizes Christ's victory. Colossians 2:15 says this, "He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him." At the cross, Jesus accomplished the ultimate conquest. The enemies we could never defeat ourselves were overcome through his death and resurrection. Sin no longer has final authority over those who belong to Christ. Death no longer has ultimate victory. Satan's defeat is certain. One day, Jesus will fully establish his kingdom, and every opposing power will finally and completely fall before him. Joshua 12 also reminds us that victory often comes one battle at a time. Israel didn't conquer the land instantly. The victories accumulated gradually. Some battles were dramatic, others were exhausting. Some victories came quickly, others required patience and endurance. And that's often how spiritual growth works in our lives as well. The Lord patiently shapes us over time. He gives victory over sin progressively. He teaches us dependence through repeated challenges. He matures our faith through long seasons of trusting him. Sometimes we become discouraged because growth feels slower than we expected. But Joshua 12 reminds us that every victory matters. Every step of obedience is consequential. Every act of faithfulness is visible to God. And the Lord is still accomplishing his purposes. And just as Joshua 12 records a finished work of conquest, believers can look forward to the day when Christ's work in us is complete. Philippians 1:6 says it this way, "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." So Joshua 12 may read like a simple historical record, but underneath the list of kings is a powerful testimony to God's faithfulness, victory, and covenant promises. It reminds us that God keeps his word, that God defeats his enemies, and that God secures an inheritance for his people. But most importantly, it points us to Jesus, the greater Joshua, whose victory will never fade and whose kingdom will never end. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Chapter a Day Bible Study. For more resources to help you in your walk with Christ and your understanding of the Bible, please visit my website at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com. And if you'd like to partner with me by becoming a supporter of this ministry, you'll see a few options to do so, again, at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com or in the description of this episode. As always, thank you for your prayers, thank you for your support, and thank you for your willingness to share this content with others. Have a great day, and I'll see you again right here tomorrow.